The investigation revealed that she had had a previous relationship with the victim's husband prior to the murder.
The investigation in 1986 is a completely different story, and the family has numerous questions about what was done during that time period.
February 24th, 1986. Sherri Rasmussen was living a seemingly perfect life. She was young, newly married to the man of her dreams, and she had done well in her nursing career. Sherri had a strong network of close friends and family and friends who would describe Sherri as a bright light for those around her. That morning, she decided to take a sick day and told her husband that she wasn't sure she would go into work that day. She had a presentation to deliver at work, and she wasn't keen on the subject matter. John, her husband, kissed her goodbye, promised not to be home too late, and left for work. John had been trying to reach Sherri all day to check in on her. Initially, he assumed she had gone into work, but when he called the hospital, they told her she hadn't come in. He still wasn't alarmed though, more annoyed that she hadn't told him she went out. She was always on his case, asking him to remember to turn the answering machine on when they left the house. So he was surprised she hadn't turned it on. He arrived home and saw that there was glass from a broken patio door in the driveway, and Sherri's car was gone. He assumed Sherri backed into something with the car, and it fell and broke the window, and he grew increasingly annoyed. It doesn't occur to him that all of these odd happenings could point to something wrong. As things began to take shape for John, he sees Sherri lying motionless on the floor, still in the nightgown she had been wearing when he left. Her face had been beaten so severely she was almost unrecognizable, and when he touched her, her body was stone cold. A distraught John calls 911, and when the operator was trying to ascertain the situation, John was unable to speak. Police quickly arrived on the scene and felt that Sherri had fought until her last breath. John told police he last saw his wife when he left for work that morning. They noted that his wife's death completely incapacitated John, and they believed his reaction was sincere. Sherri had been a brilliant woman. From 16, she went straight into college and discovered her love for nursing. She lived to help others. By her late 20s, Sherri had worked through the ranks to be a nursing instructor and was passionate about teaching nursing students. It was at a college party that she met John, a mechanical engineering student. Their relationship moved quickly, and he moved into her condo. The two became husband and wife in November 1985, but they hadn't been together very long when odd things began happening in their relationship. After their engagement party, a woman had shown up at their house. She had been wearing revealing workout attire and was holding skis and asked to speak to John. John explained to Sherri that the woman was an ex-girlfriend named Stephanie Lazarus. He told her that they were still friends and that he had promised Stephanie he would wax her skis. Sherri was furious that this woman felt it was appropriate to just show up at their home unannounced. This was also the first time hearing that her fiancé had this ex-girlfriend in his life. She told John that she didn't want him to contact Stephanie, but John told her she was being ridiculous and to stop being jealous. When Lazarus came back a few days later to pick up the freshly waxed skis, she showed up in her full police uniform, complete with a gun. Sherri was unnerved to find out Lazarus was a cop. She would tell her best friend that she had felt this weird hostility from Lazarus. After that, they would keep randomly bumping into each other very often while Lazarus was on patrol. Sherri confided to her father that she thought Lazarus was stalking her. A few weeks went by when Lazarus went to the hospital that Sherri worked at and told her that she and John had had sex after the engagement party. Lazarus explicitly said, "If I can't have John, no one can."
They told of times when Stephanie Lazarus appeared at Sherri Rasmussen's place of work at Glendale Adventist and told Sherri Rasmussen, "If I cannot have John, nobody can."
It was only a few weeks until their wedding, and Sherri was once again blindsided by this stranger who kept inserting herself into her life. Sherri confronted John about it immediately, and he had admitted it was true. He had slept with Stephanie, but it was the last time he hadn't since then. He said it was for closure for Stephanie. He reassured Sherri that he didn't want to be with Stephanie. He wanted to be with her. It highlights how desperate Lazarus was to break up the couple. Sherri told John that if they were to get married, he needed to cut Stephanie out of his life, and she wasn't to come by their home anymore. After Sherri's murder, friends and family were shocked that John wasn't more involved in the investigation to find Sherri's killer. John had quit his job and moved out of LA a few months after his wife was murdered. Sherri's father, Nuys Rasmussen, and police were convinced that John was holding back information. John said that he had told detectives to investigate his ex-girlfriend. Still, records show he didn't point detectives in that direction until years later. Sherri's father had become her champion, continually pushing police officers to look into her case. In the weeks leading up to her death, Sherri had told her friends an unsettling story about an ex-girlfriend of John's coming to her office and telling Sherri that, "If I can't have John, no one can. And when this marriage doesn't work out, I'll be there to pick up the pieces." A co-worker told police that Sherri couldn't go anywhere without this ex-girlfriend showing up, often in uniform and armed. Sherri had been suspicious that Stephanie and her husband still had an ongoing intimate relationship, but John always denied it, accusing Sherri of being too jealous. John didn't support Sherri's feelings of being fearful of Stephanie, and Sherri had told friends she was thinking about breaking up with John before their marriage because of it. Sherri had also told her father a few days before she was murdered that she was being followed by a person dressed in men's clothing but had piercing eyes that could stare through you. When Sherri's father had been detailing this information to the lead detective, the detective told him that he was watching too much TV. When the lead detective retired, new detectives went through the case. They noted the case file was missing a lot of information. The only leads noted in the case were the ones that had gone in the burglary direction. Sherri's father, John, and Sherri's co-workers had all given statements, but officers never followed up. Current detectives gave credit to Sherri's father for never giving up on her. Nuys badgered law enforcement to reopen the case and do DNA testing. He even offered to pay for it himself. He was unsuccessful for many years, and after many appeals, he was able to get the DNA evidence collected at the murder tested. At this point, there was no longer any denying justice. The evidence was too much to push off. The DNA sample had been taken from a bite mark on Sherri's arm. Sherri's investigation was sloppy, and negligent police work that was so poorly handled it looked to be a cover-up. That was the only explanation as to why Sherri's murderer went unnoticed for almost 2 decades. In the late 1990s, once DNA evidence began being critical for convictions, the LA Police Department formed a new unit that looked through forensic evidence collected from cold case files and ran them through the various databases to see if anything came of it. In 2004, Jennifer Butterworth was assigned the Rasmussen file. Butterworth noted that not all the evidence was in the box. The DNA evidence had been checked out by an officer in 2003 and never put back. She spent days hunting for it, and after a week, she found it in the back of the coroner's freezer. She ran the samples through and reaffirmed that most of the DNA evidence was Sherri's. However, the bite mark sample was determined to be a female, and it didn't hit any matches in CODIS. This completely changed the theory that Sherri had been murdered by 2 men. Butterworth had begun to go through the rest of the evidence on the case.
The investigation in 1986 is a completely different story, and the family has numerous questions about what was done during that time period.
In 2009, detectives Jim Nuttall and Pete Barba came across the Rasmussen file and thought it was interesting. The thing that drew them to the case was the DNA evidence pointing to a female assailant, contradicting the long-held belief that 2 men had killed Sherri. Stephanie Lazarus quickly made it to the top of the suspect list. Nuttall and Barba theorized what they would do if they were to commit a murder. They thought that it would be best to do it on a day off, and they wouldn't be able to use their duty gun because losing that would open up an investigation. Using a backup or personal weapon wouldn't. They also considered their knowledge, having worked only a few years as a patrol officer. Records showed that on the day of the murder, Lazarus had been off duty. Lazarus had also reported a .38 caliber weapon stolen, just 13 days after the murder. Lastly, a working patrol officer would know just enough to make a crime scene look like a burglary. Stephanie Lazarus had begun her career in the LA Police Department as a beat cop. Stephanie had always been described as a cop's cop. They began a stakeout to recover something with a sample of her DNA. As she exited a Costco, they saw her toss a drink cup into the trash. The cup was retrieved and tested next to the bite mark sample, which was a partial match, enough of a match to get an arrest warrant. The detectives began to plan for a quiet arrest. The case was presented only to senior officers and prosecutors. Everything needed to be handled carefully. They didn't want her to be tipped off. On the day of the arrest, a dozen officers were brought into the department before dawn, each given search warrants and were told to wait. Meanwhile, Lazarus began her commute into the city. Specific detectives were assigned to handle the arrest, all of them selected because they didn't have a personal connection to Lazarus. They decided to call Lazarus down to the Parker Center. This location was selected because Lazarus would need to surrender her weapon to enter. This minimized the possibility of her harming herself or other officers when she was to be arrested. Lazarus thought she would be interviewing a suspect in one of her cases. Instead, she was sat in a room with Detectives Stearns and Jaramillo. Her interrogation did not go well. She denied any involvement in Sherri's murder. After the interrogation, Lazarus was arrested. Once she was arrested, her home, car, and office were searched. Police located her journals from the mid-1980s. In the journals, she detailed her feelings on John's engagement with Sherri and her depression that followed. Her home computer showed she continued to do internet searches on John Ruetten on several occasions during the 90s. As the investigation progressed, coworkers began coming forward detailing Lazarus's erratic behavior in the workplace. Her office nickname was Spazarus, but all seemed shocked that she was capable of murder. All active cases that Lazarus had been involved in had to be dropped, and she was allowed early retirement. She was held in Los Angeles County Jail for 6 months before her sentencing hearing.
Stephanie Ilene Lazarus, guilty of the crime of murder of Sherri Rasmussen in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony as charged in Count 1 of the information. We further find the murder was of the first degree.
To which the judge set a $10 million bail for fear that Lazarus may flee the country or harm herself. Her trial began in 2012, and the story made for a tremendous media spectacle. In this case, there wasn't a lot of evidence. Most of the evidence had gone missing over the years, or never collected in the first place. Once Lazarus was arrested, a better DNA sample collected was a complete match. The main testimonies in the trial were that Lazarus had stalked Sherri, the DNA evidence, and the journals.
The matter will continue back here in Department 30 on July 6th at 8:30.
Your Honor, there's one other matter. There's a typographical error in the complaint.
Lawyers for Lazarus argued that the evidence had been mishandled and shouldn't be included in the trial. During the trial, it was revealed that Ruetten and Lazarus had kept in touch in the years following Sherri's murder. They had even vacationed in Hawaii together. Ruetten broke down several times during the trial and described his time with Lazarus was a mistake. The jury decided to convict Lazarus of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years in prison, and she will be eligible for parole when she is 79 years old.